Well, I'm Philip Heselton. I first read a book called Witchcraft Today back in 1959 by a chap called Gerald Gardner, and we got it out of the local library. It spoke to me. It wasn't so much the words, but something in between the words, and I felt there's something here. Gardner was described as a member of one of the witch covens that still survive in England, and that made me feel really excited. What's it going on here? And anyway, I read it, and I finally got a copy of it myself, and I read his other books, and I gradually got more and more interested, and I wanted to find out more about. He's supposed to have been initiated into a surviving coven of witches,
yes.
And I wanted to find out more about that, and what happened, etc. And I sort of read, most of what I read was a bit vague and a bit sort of, and it was really...
Do you think by that it was deliberate that he wrote in that sense?
No, it was the way that he wrote, he astrologically, he had the sun in Gemini, and he was a very typical of that particular sign, and flitting about from one thing to another. He could never really concentrate on one thing, and he wasn't very good at putting stuff down, really. Wasn't really that good a writer, to be honest. But what he was talking about was very interesting. So I got quite interested when Doreen Valiente, who's one of the other people who became very much involved with the craft, found that she wanted to find out more, and she did research, and she went up to various archives and record offices and things like that, and she found out quite a lot about it. And I thought, yes, this is the sort of thing I want to find out about. And I was really interested in that. What I hadn't realised is that what I was doing was research into history. And I thought I didn't like history. I only got 6% at school in history, and they decided that perhaps I should give it up. And I thought, I'm no good at history, I don't like history, blah, blah, blah. But only after I was doing this research, finding out a bit more about what I think happened and some of the people that were involved with Gerald Gardner, that I realised, yes, well, actually it is historical research, And of course, once I'd found out quite a lot of that stuff, it was natural to me to write a book about it, which I did, and I've subsequently written several others. So there's still stuff to find out. I'm sure of that, but it's a start, and it's fascinating.
I'm sure it is. That period of time is hotly debated by some people, of course. How you mentioned just there about what was who initiated him. Well, although it's read in his books, obviously it's explored in some of yours. It's never really has it actually been concreted down where this long line of people perhaps came from. Was it a secret order what has survived through generations and over almost 1,000 years, and if not longer, or was it something that was rediscovered as a new version of something that a practice was forgotten? How do you feel about that?
I can certainly tell you what I think happened. At the moment, I won't say I'm finished with Gerald Gardner, but I've done quite a bit on him. What I'm interested in now is the people that he claimed initiated him into the craft. And what I think happened is that I don't really know actually, but you see, one of the things might be that there are traditions of witchcraft in this country, in England, going back quite a long time, and they're natural, they're farmers and people like that were involved in it. It wasn't intellectual, and it was sort of the land. And I think some of those people were involved. But also you got intellectuals, you got people that studied magical orders, and people like the Rosicrucians and the Co-Masons and all those sort of things. They were involved in that. And at some step, one of the other things, yes, that they were interested in was reincarnation. They believed quite firmly that they had had previous lifetimes. And some of them felt that they had had previous lifetimes as witches. And therefore it was a fairly narrow step to say, well, we were witches in a previous lifetime, we can be witches again. And I think that they gradually developed this as one of their interests. And it may well be that Gerald Gardner was the very first person who was ever initiated into it, because it gradually took form, and I'm talking about the 1920s and 30s here, so that by the time he was initiated in 1939, it was what we would now call a witch coven, but it had only really been in existence for a few years. I think, I may be wrong, I think there's a lot more to find out.
Good, really, really good. So, tomorrow, of course, is a day for Patricia Crowther.
Indeed.
And you've been invited as a speaker. What do you think about the Doreen Valiente Foundation, Centre for Pagan Studies, and how important they are, historically? Obviously, you're talking about yourself and your initiation into looking at historical context again. I mean, how that's been a passion for you, how that's taken your now life as that of the direction. So how important it is tomorrow for you and the wider audience out there?
Well, I think it's good, first of all, that Patricia Crowther is being recognised as one of the great people in the craft who have developed it and publicised it over the years, and it's very good that that is being recognised. My talk is basically going to be about the people that initiated Gerald Gardner, and one of the main points that I wanted to make is that they were basically mostly women. I've called the talk Mothers of the Wicca, and it's basically about that. As I say, there's a lot more to be discovered, and that's my next research topic after I've finished writing my current book, which is a biography of Doreen Valiente, and that will be for the Doreen Valiente Foundation and the Centre for Pagan Studies, and they intend to publish it when I finish writing it. I haven't quite finished writing it yet.
Of course, there's always, when you finish a book, there's always things you want to throw in there afterwards. There's always stuff to bring into it. So it'd be really good. Have you got, say, an estimated time of arrival, shall we say?
Well, you see, most of my publishers have been very good to me, and they say, oh, don't worry, just send it in when it's ready, don't worry. Rather than, we want it by the end of October, come what may. So I've been rather sort of relaxed about this, okay. And it's actually been several years since I was asked to write it. But it is getting done now, and I hope to get a first draft done this summer. Well, I don't know, I know that the Foundation are very keen to publish it, so we'll have to see how it, but I reckon probably next year, I would think next year it'll appear.
Okay. Well, I'm Ashley Mortimer. I'm a trustee of the Doreen Valiente Foundation, and I'm a director of the Centre for Pagan Studies. So I guess when Philip refers to being commissioned by the publishers, that would indicate me.
It would.
And for those that don't know, the Doreen Valiente Foundation are the custodians of Doreen's legacy. She left behind to her last working partner, John Bellam Payne, all of her magical legacy, which involved a lot of books, documents, artefacts, and indeed knowledge and information, photographs, postcards, and what have you. And so it's fallen upon us to try and arrange this in such a way that researchers like Philip, who are eminent in the field already, have an opportunity to access what Doreen left behind, and maybe we can learn and uncover some of the things that she was interested in researching herself. Because it's become very apparent to me that Doreen was particularly interested in Gerald's background, and that she inquired quite firmly into, or quite strongly, into the sort of things that Gerald was doing. And I think it's quite apparent that she was looking in some way to find validation of the things that Gerald had told her.
I'm sure that's true. Doreen had so many facets to her personality and her life, and as you say, the material that she left is vast in extent, and I am absolutely certain that mine will not be the last biography of Doreen. There's material there where people can go into a lot more detail, and I'm sure that over the, next 100 years, there will be people doing that sort of research and writing about her.
I mean, certainly Doreen's role in the history and the unfolding modern history of the craft is much understated in many ways. Gerald's credited with being the prime mover in things, but very much you were talking about Gerald being finding it easy to hop from subject to subject, and it was the presence in Gerald's life of people like Doreen who sort of pulled him back and said, "Stop a minute, let's do this way, and let's do that." And it was Doreen, in fact, who helped Gerald put the modern craft as Gerald understood it into such a framework that it became translatable to others. And whether that's for the good or the bad, I don't know. But Doreen certainly put her own mark on things. But she helped Gerald, I think, in many ways to organise his own thoughts on the subject and to pull things together in such a way that it made a framework.
Doreen was sensible.
Are you implying that Gerald wasn't?
Gerald was not sensible. And yet, what she combined was both that down-to-earth sensibility, with a very strong feeling of the spirit in nature. I think, in essence, she was happier just going out at night under a full moon and communing, if you like, with the spirits that are there, rather than elaborate rituals. It's not to say she didn't do elaborate rituals, sometimes she did, but I think her heart was really in that, that simple approach to spirit and magic, which she wrote about quite a bit.
Doreen was undoubtedly inspired by the energies in which she was in contact with. She was certainly inspired, and she certainly had a great, as many pagans do, and as witches do traditionally and up to now, she had a great sense of the inspiration of her connection with the natural world. And you're quite right. However, she was also, in the more mundane side of her life, quite a pragmatist. And I think she realised that, having been so close to Gerald, she had a duty, and I think she saw it as such, as a responsibility, if you like, to the craft, now that Gerald had exposed it. And I think she took that duty quite seriously. But she was very pragmatic about it, and the way that she comported herself privately and publicly is almost exemplary. And I've been accused of describing her as Saint Doreen of the Wicca. But to some extent there's a truth to that. However, she was certainly inspired as well, and she's not an intellectual writer on the subject. She's a woman who had a great passion for the subject and a massively deep knowledge.
Oh yes.
And it's only since the work of yourself and in fact since we've been really putting the collection that she left behind in order, that we've started to discover quite what the breadth of Doreen's knowledge was.
Oh yes.
She's quite an extraordinary lady in that respect.
Yes, and we keep finding sort of things that she was involved in, things that she was interested in. It's vast, really. And she, as well as her books, which was one of the things that she was most known for, really now, she wrote a large number of articles in magazines, some of which, we're not even, we don't really know at the moment how much she wrote, but on a vast range of topics. She was very knowledgeable, undoubtedly.
I mean, like you, I don't come from a very historical background. My history at school was, if you were 6%, I was probably 4. I'm a bit more of a scientific background. And really, in some ways, I've felt myself thrust into this interest in history, and I've found that I've developed an interest that I didn't have. But what's really startling to me is that such modern history that's only 50 or 60 years old, we know so little.
Oh yes, yes indeed.
And it's so difficult. You imagine, or I imagined as an outsider and coming into it, that it was all laid out in the history books, and that the books and records officers would show everything that you would need to know. And it's quite startling to me how little people know about each other's lives and each other's histories. Yeah. And surely to come out in the book are some quite maybe shocking, but certainly startling things about Doreen's activities in her life, about which we can't say very much. You'll have to buy the book.
No, wait. Yeah. No, I mean...
but, we've been quite surprised ourselves with what we discovered about the woman we thought we knew quite a bit about.
Oh, yes, indeed. I mean, and what it is, it's about little bits of information. It's not all written down, it goes here in this book, oh, there it is, that's it. It's little tiny bits of information. And sometimes you can put them together, 2 little bits together, and then you think, that's why that happened. It is like a jigsaw puzzle, very much like that. You're putting bits together, you think, oh yes, they fit together, and that's exciting. It really is exciting. And we're still at that stage. And Doreen particularly, I mean, one of the advantages, if you like, with Gerald, I mean, Patricia is probably one of the few people that still actually remembers Gerald, because he died 50 years ago. With Doreen, who died less than 20 years ago, there's a lot more people that remember her, and that's good. Well, it's also a bit of a task for me, because I have to try and talk to them all, and I won't talk to everybody, but I've already...
we will.
Yes, well, eventually.
It's an ongoing work to do, and
indeed.
there's a research project to do exactly that, because the oral testimony of people is very important too.
It is.
And particularly while there's still people who are alive who have the living memory. I've been recently amused to discover that there are parallels being drawn with other religions that have sprung up from cult-like activity. And in some ways, people like yourself, and then perhaps the next generation on which looks like it might be people like me, are seen as the Gnostic gospel writers of if you want to, in that rather than being first-hand accounts of what happened, which are usually very important pieces of, obviously most important pieces of evidence, but sometimes can be somewhat glazed over with a desire to present things in a certain way, since you are the person who's involved. Whereas the second round, when I say the Gnostic gospel writers, the people who wrote the second round of things are the people who've had time to assimilate more of the evidence from those who were. And in that respect, you can be a little bit more objective about things.
Yes.
And I think it's certainly true to say the people who knew Gerald are not all very objective about him. No. And then you wouldn't be about your friend. If you were asked to make a public statement about a friend of yours, you might say things differently about them to the way that history will paint them.
Yeah, I mean, there was an earlier biography of Gerald, published in 1960, called Gerald Gardner Witch, largely written by the Sufi scholar Idris Shah, and partly by Jack Bracelet, whose name actually appears on the cover. And this has been described as a hagiography, which is in fact a sort of like saying only nice things about him, basically.
Gerald was quite heavily involved in the way that came out.
Yes, that's right.
He was still alive when it was published.
He was indeed, and I thought, well, my books about Gerald are not hagiographies. I say some uncomplimentary things about him, and I'm quite... I think that's the only valid way of approach, really, just to be as honest as one can about these things. I mean, unless I wouldn't have written the book unless I was basically sympathetic to him, put it that way. Not to say I agree with him about everything, I certainly don't. Similarly with Doreen, I mean, unless I'm basically sympathetic to her, I wouldn't have taken on the task of writing
No, but that said, as part of the commission, one of the things we said is you'll have full access to all of the research materials we can give you, and whatever we discover, what we want is the truth. Because that's really what we need to get at.
Yes,
and I think there's a certain degree of sympathy, but there's also a certain degree of confidence that that truth will reveal generally good things about these people who we both, I mean, you know, we respect. I haven't become a trustee of Doreen's legacy because I don't respect her. So I'm pretty confident that she will turn out, if not to be St. Doreen of the Wicca, or heaven forbid, St. Gerald of the Wicca, as it were. Yeah. You know, and there's an interesting theory that a friend of mine has, who and she says that she thinks that one of the reasons that Wicca, or Gerald's brand of witchcraft, broke out in the way that it has, and has become a world religion, as opposed to a minor cult, is one of the crucial factors is that Gerald in some ways was a slightly flawed character.
Oh, really?
And that had he been the great Gerald who everybody was sitting at the feet of listening to the guru, it would have happened in the way that many cults do. It would have had a short but brief explosion of interest and then imploded on itself. And the very fact that nobody could sit at the great Gerald's feet is because this framework then that Doreen put in place, these factors combined and allowed it to spread and percolate into the wider consciousness, and other people to come along and discover that they had similar feelings. And you know,
yeah, I mean that's very true. I mean, you know, it encourages you to think for yourself, basically.
If you're researching Gerald, you have no choice, really.
You have no choice, and it doesn't tend to attract people who want a complete answer to everything. You know, like, go here, this book has the complete answer to everything. It's the only right religion and that sort of thing. We're not like that at all. There are tendencies in certain certain tendencies towards that in certain parts of the craft, but generally it's not like that. And you know, people wouldn't be attracted to it unless they are what we would want, which is them to think for themselves. And to me that's very important.
I think to some extent you're describing things from the initiated craft point of view. And I think that what Gerald and perhaps lesser, Doreen wasn't so aware, Gerald certainly was unaware that the thing that he'd publicised or made public had grown to the extent it has. I think Gerald would be very surprised to discover that there were people in all corners of the world who call themselves Wiccan these days. But I think what we have to accept is that there is still a traditional initiated craft, whatever that tradition may be. And it certainly isn't a written down tradition, not really. As you say, it's encouraging you to think for yourself and to continue those trains of thought. And there's a way in which you can do that. But much wider than that, there's a sort of outer circle of literally millions of people who consider themselves related spiritually in some way to the current that is Wicca, and that although the two are distinct, there's certainly a great kinship between those who are following initiated traditional paths and those who simply associate themselves with the notions they've read about in the wider world. And in that way, Gerald really performed an amazing function because he took the craft from an underground secret or an underground society, group that had secrets, to a much wider audience and a much wider public.
And Doreen was equally, very much. I mean, she didn't deny the value of being initiated into a traditional coven and learning stuff that way. But she did have. There was one thing that she always said was, "Who initiated the first witch?" So, in other words, you know, you don't have to be initiated by somebody else in order to practice the craft. And indeed, her book, Witchcraft for Tomorrow, was very much in favour of, if people want to practice the craft, this is the way that you can one of the ways that you can do it. And because certainly in those days, and I think even, you know, now we've forgotten how rare it was, and how difficult it was to actually contact anybody who was involved with it. I'd read Gardner's book, as I was saying, back in 1959. I wasn't initiated into the craft until 2002. That's 43 years. You know, and nowadays you can go on, a few seconds you can go onto the internet and you can find websites and all the rest of it. Very, very easy. But in Doreen's day, it wasn't. And she wrote that book for people who had that inner feeling that they wanted to experience that spirit in nature. And she helped them as much as she could. And it didn't matter that you hadn't got anyone to initiate you. It was good if you had, but don't let that stop you. I think that was basically what she was saying.
I mean, certainly there's a sort of perception amongst those who have a small bit of knowledge. We all know a bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. But there's a perception that Doreen and Gerald were together orchestrating this great revival of the craft. And in actual fact, Doreen and Gerald didn't work together for very long magically. And Doreen went on to have experiments in other traditions and other things and so on, didn't she?
Yes, and eventually she got fed up with all these people, you know. Oh, I'm fed up with all this. I'm just going to do it myself, you know. And I think she was happiest, as I say, just going out, night of the full moon, going up onto the downs above where she lived in Brighton, with the wind and the trees, and just being and experiencing that spirit that's there. And I think she was happier doing that than anything else. And she almost certainly knew people locally who had been part of ancient witchcraft, old witchcraft, pre-Gardner. They're not the sort of people to go to pagan conferences with big pentagrams on their t-shirts, you know. They just do things in the way that they've done for generations.
Well, certainly those people still exist. Gardner was aware of them also.
He was certainly aware.
He went to some great lengths to associate himself with Scottish lines, which is where he saw a lot of those traditional and hereditary lines coming from, or discovered them.
Yes.
And there are other people who have information that relates to that too.
And in the Isle of Man, I mean, he opened a museum in the Isle of Man, and people approached him, you know.
Well, I mean, I've heard this phrase. Yes, I mean, Gerald really was exploratory as well, wasn't he? And I've heard this phrase recently. Somebody said, "Well, you know, Jesus wasn't a Christian. Well, Gerald wasn't a Gardnerian, was he?"
No, he wasn't. Gardnerian was used initially as a term of abuse
by Robert Cochrane, wasn't it?
Associate of Robert Cochrane, and like Quaker, you know, Quakers originally that was a term of abuse. They adopted it. And so also Gardnerians adopted it. My personal view about the term Gardnerian is that it could apply to anyone who has been influenced by Gerald Gardner. In other words, anything other than old traditional craft that predates him. Although some people use it in a very much more specific sense. And I don't think he'd be very happy with the term Gardnerian.
Well, Doreen wasn't. She certainly knew what was being talked about when somebody referred to Gardnerians.
Yeah.
In fact, doesn't she say in The Rebirth of Witchcraft that there was a move afoot to deal with the Gardnerians and to have a Night of the Long Knives?
Oh yes, this was Cochrane.
And her quote back was that he wanted to have a Night of the Long Knives, but I told him he could have it on his own.
Yes, precisely. And you know, and this happened time and again. I mean, there was the split with Gerald initially on the grounds of his publicity, that he'd sort of sworn them all to secrecy when they were initiated, and yet he gave interviews to scurrilous newspapers, such as News of the World. I can mention that because it doesn't exist anymore, I think.
He wasn't the best judge of character in any respect, was he, Gerald?
No, and he admitted that himself, you know, that he was taken in by these reporters. And And they said, well, look, we don't want... And he was initiating people that they considered to be unsuitable. I think he felt he's been described as an old man in a hurry. He felt that he didn't want it to die out.
Do you think he could have been influenced in that respect by his view of Crowley, having met him and seeing another old man in a hurry who didn't want his own little thing to die out?
Possibly, yes.
Do you think perhaps he later, after Crowley's death, and that Gerald in some ways perhaps pitied Crowley a bit and thought, well, I don't want to end up like him with casting about desperately for someone to pass it on to.
I think that's probably true, and so he probably did initiate people, more people than we know about, probably, including some probably unsuitable ones. But some of them stuck, you know.
No, certainly.
And it got going.
Certainly, there are other lines. I mean, my own line has its roots in Scotland, and I know that from my initiators and the people slightly up the tree from me, that Gerald was mixing in circles that have names that are not known so well and widely publicised, and that we call our line the Ayrshire Wicca, and it comes through from there. But there are other people around on that scene that Gerald was making himself known to and becoming interested in, who may not possibly have. He brought others in as well. Certainly, he was bringing other people in, but he was making contacts, and he spent a considerable amount of time and effort doing so.
Indeed, yeah.
This is a fascinating conversation, and you and I should sit and talk about this sort of thing more, because you always inspire me, Philip.
Oh, do I? Oh,
yeah, you always inspire me to remember how interested in things I am and how little time I allow myself to spend thinking.
I was just thinking the way that you were talking inspired me, so that's very good.
Oh, it's mutual then. I'm so delighted. I'm so pleased. Well, certainly you're going to publish the book under our auspices or under our under our banner, and we intend to do more, and we're looking for more authors to do other books that encourage more and more people to find their way to their own, the absolute.
We still haven't got a title for the book, but that, if anyone's got any ideas.
Saint Doreen of the Wicca.
Yeah.
No. Cut.
That'll come.
Okay.
Shall we call it there?
Yeah, we should.